Hello there, listening audience, and welcome back to another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is Michael Cross here, and before I get started with our very special guest tonight, I always do a little plug. That is, I'd encourage people to come to my website at michaelcross.net, where I've written a lot of articles on social control and psychology and how it's used to manipulate people. And also, well, sign up for my Twitter at as a follower if you wish. It's at PsychoMike777. Okay, and tonight we have Ayla, and she is going to tell us a little bit about today's, probably I would say, most important, number one, without a doubt, far greater than the economic crisis, far greater than ISIS. Yeah, it kind of rhymes, doesn't it? And so forth. But that is actually what's happening to the American family in, specifically and in general, Western families. And, well, let's just go ahead and get to Ayla here. Hi, Ayla.
Hi.
I've seen one of your interviews recently, and you talked a lot about, well, I kind of got into this whole idea of where's the children? And, and that was combined with the fact that you don't come from a conservative background. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's get into that. Where'd all the children go?
Oh, okay. So my background, I was raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is a pretty liberal area in a lot of ways. I went to a extremely liberal high school where I had actually former Black Panther members as teachers, and it was a performing arts school, so very high homosexual population, and so it was very liberal, artistic types that went there, and then went on to, get a liberal arts degree, a bachelor's degree, went on to get a master's degree in the school that I went to was in San Francisco. So I lived up in the Bay Area, which is kind of the liberal mecca, for about almost 10 years. And so I was completely steeped in the liberal movement. I was a feminist. I was pro-gay marriage. I actually, phone banked in favor of gay marriage at the Gay and Lesbian Center through most of my college career and that sort of thing. I got married and settled down with my husband, and I have 5 children. And it was about the time that my second child came along. My oldest was 3, and then I had my second child, that liberal ideology seemed to not line up with the reality of the world that I was experiencing. And one of the things that I'd always kept very close to my heart throughout my childhood, throughout my teen years, and throughout my college career was dedication to the idea of being a traditional mother. As far back as I can remember being a little girl, I was the kind of little girl that was obsessed with baby dolls and playing house, and I would, put baby dolls under my t-shirt and pretend to be pregnant and pretend to give birth. I just loved all of those things, and I held on to that idea that I wanted to be a mom, and I love academia, academia and scholarship, and I love studying, and I obviously loved going to university and attaining diplomas and certifications and things like that. But it was all I kind of was doing that while I was waiting to have children. My whole life I was just waiting to get to the point where I could have babies and stay home with my babies and homeschool my babies and nurse my babies. And so I always had that as a constant thread and focus. And once I got there, once I was actually a mom and I was living a very naturally, like a natural motherhood life where I'm giving birth, I was breastfeeding, I was staying at home, I was doing the cooking, I was doing the cleaning, I was doing all these things that I always wanted to do. I realized that there was a stark difference between reality and family life and community life, and then what liberals like to espouse, especially in academic circles. And there was this disconnect between the salt of the earth people that are actually doing things and the ivory tower elite academics who are simply coming up with theories and ideas. And their theories and ideas, these liberal theories and ideas of gay marriage or any of these other constructs meant to change traditional society, they can write, these people are very bright, and they can write these amazing papers, books, editorials, and give very articulate interviews on news programs, and they can sound really correct. And if you're not a mother yet, if you're not a father yet, if you're not really living a traditional life or working with real people in the real world, then you tend to buy into that philosophy from those academic liberals. It tends to make sense. You say, well, it sounds very smart. It sounds like they have thought this out really well. It's kind of like the communism versus capitalism. Communism can sound really great on paper. You can read about it and say, oh, well, doesn't that sound lovely? Doesn't that sound like that would work? But what we've seen in reality is that it never works. It's been tried over and over and over and over again, and it never works. And that was kind of this, I came to this moment of this disconnect between there's liberalism and then there's reality. And reality is conservatism. Reality, the way we need to live our lives in order to thrive and to grow and to have strong communities and strong societies and strong families, those are conservative values. Those are traditional values. Not what these liberals are theorizing. They live in a world of theory that is never applicable to real life.
Yeah, I think it's something very, very fascinating in that if we're talking academia. Now, you also noted too that maybe some people are thinking, okay, she's probably like a Catholic or something or a fundamentalist. But in the time period that you were into academia and all these things were going on, you were also Wiccan or pagan or
I was pagan. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I was what I would consider. I called myself a Dianic tradition pagan, for the most part, which means that I was so hardcore feminist that I refused to acknowledge the idea of a male deity. That deity could only be female, could only be feminine. That's how much I was into that. And so I consider that would be what's called Dianic tradition. So as opposed to seeing there being a god and a goddess, I worshipped exclusively a goddess. And I was incredibly active in that community. In fact, that's what my master's degree is in women's spirituality. So it's kind of a study of women's theology, and where it wasn't exclusively pagan, I studied all faiths and all religions. It was heavily influenced by pagan thought and pagan ideologies, simply because paganism tends to be heavily feminine in its deification. So so I was pagan until until age 28, 29. So that was my conversion religiously happened around the same time as my conservative conversion. However, I think that they were both related yet not. They would have happened, I believe, independently of each other. And in fact, when I first converted to Christianity, I was still very liberal. When I was baptized, I had blue hair, and I actually wore a goddess necklace to my baptism. So I was still it wasn't that I converted to Christianity and suddenly became a conservative. Became a conservative and then converted to Christianity because it fit my new outlook. It was a much different process than that for me. And so when you kind of present timeline of my life, they both kind of worked independently of each other, but also worked together at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that, I mean, I actually have met libertarian, pagans and so forth. So there's a wide range there of pagans. And what I've noticed is that there is a different, there's different types of pagans, and there's different types of Christians, and there's different types of even feminists. I've noticed that many feminists are not of the more libertarian background. Now you do get exceptions like Camille Paglia and others who, you know, they believe in feminism and they're like some of the founders of modern day feminism, but more of a, well, if this woman wants to work as a CEO of a corporation, great, let's affirm her. If this woman wants to stay at home and have 10 kids, that's great, let's affirm her. It seems to have turned to a large degree to where now many feminists, it's like a very negative thing that's aimed at those who do choose a more traditional lifestyle. And by the way, you're not the kind of, I mean, when you say conservative, that rings bells in some people's minds. I mean, are you kind of conservative as in the values of conservatism, or are you like conservative like, I don't know, John McCain type, you know, let's go bald?
No. No. I'm more alternative, like alt-right, like alternative right, like traditionalist conservative. I don't align myself with most of the conservative movement in America. Not really, you know, a GOP girl. In fact, I've never voted Republican in my entire life, and I actually only recently registered as a Republican simply so I could vote in the upcoming primaries. And once I'm able to do that, I'll register an independent again. So no, not a John McCain conservative, not a Bush conservative. If Bush, you know, if we had another term of a Bush presidency, I would probably be out speaking against them as much as I speak out against Obama. So I'm not in that duality, that American political duality where there's the conservative and liberal. I mean conservative from a traditionalist point of view.
Right, and going into that, like, you know, we talk about some of the conservatives are more neocons, and a lot of people throw that word around without actually knowing what it means. It basically means a person who believes in kind of a consumeristic-based economy, which ultimately evolves into consumerism, plus an interventionist foreign policy, which means, well, if we don't like you, we destroy your country and take your resources from you. And it seems that this consumerism in today's society has actually contributed to I think it's one of the reasons why, even beyond just, you know, maybe some feminism and stuff like that, we've really broken down the family structure. It's no longer important to people. And you know, you said something about where you live. One time noticed there was no children.
Right. Yes, definitely. When I lived up in San Francisco, and with the community I lived in San Francisco well, I didn't live in San Francisco. I lived above in the North Bay area, but yeah, you could go long periods of time without seeing children at all. In grocery stores or out, you know, just out and about, and because the population of children was so low in those areas.
Yeah. What do you attribute to this? Why do you think? I mean, you've got 5 children, and you go to a church that, you know, people have kids. What do you attribute to this kind of negative attitude where kids are almost seen in the same way as it's an option kind of out there, sort of, you know, orbiting the bigger picture of, you know, what you're going to buy, where you're going to travel, you know, what's going on in your opinion?
Well, there's so many factors, but I think basically it's because the Western world has really become a world where we're lovers of pleasure. And whatever pleasure that is, we want to validate that. And so it becomes a sense of selfishness, and children are viewed as a burden, that they're a hindrance to living your life the way you want to, you know, having a career, you know, this powerful career that they show women and men having on TV, and, you know, being able to sleep in till noon on your day off and hang out at the Starbucks with your friends and laugh and chuckle the way you would see an episode on TV of How I Met Your Mother or one of these popular shows. And people want to spend their money on themselves. They want to be able to have the designer clothes or take a lot of vacations or these sorts of things. And where once there was a sense of identity that came from your culture, your traditions, and your ancestors, And of course, when you're thinking about your ancestors, when you're thinking about your culture and that you're a part of that, you're naturally thinking ahead towards your contribution to that, which would be your children. But now we have completely cut ourselves off from any sense of national identity, from cultural identity, from ethnic identity in the Western world. And in fact, most people hate Western identity. They say, well, we're colonial and they disparage it. They're not proud of it. They're not proud of their ancestors. They don't have a sense of who they are and where they came from. And so then they don't have a sense of passing that on to children. And but that identity, that need that we have as human beings to understand who we are in the greater context of the world, when that used to be filled by tradition and ancestors and family and country and home, we have to fill it with something else. It creates a vacuum. And so consumerism, popular culture, these have all rushed in to fill that vacuum within people in that void. And so they relate their identity to what they're consuming and what they're doing. So maybe they identify with the geek culture. So they're going to Comic-Con and they're buying comic books and they're owning every sci-fi movie on DVD and they have the latest tech gear. Or maybe they're, a woman who identifies as, a career woman and she has to have the latest, stylish business suit and eat at the finest restaurants and identifies herself maybe as like, a Manhattan liberal New York type. So we find our identities through this consumer culture as opposed to who we are in relationship to our traditions and our ancestors.
Yeah, which ultimately, I mean, you brought up media there, and, you have shows like How I Met Your Mother, before that, Friends, even the series Big Bang Theory, where you have people that it's depicting this idea that it's fashionable to be, in your 30s, unmarried, yet you're still trying to find yourself. And it's like this, and that's another show. It's like an Arrested Development. I mean, people are living their adolescent years when they're practically ready for menopause.
Exactly. We keep pushing off responsibility. And whereas, if you go back to the Middle Ages, by the time a boy was 12 or 13, he needed to start buckling down and apprenticing with a shoemaker or a wood carver, figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. So in a few years he could get married. And our teens really had purpose and drive. And if you look at Amish communities, for example, they stop regular education at 8th grade. Once their kids can read and write and do math and function academically, then they start buckling down and saying, okay, you need to start planning for your future. You need to take on responsibility. You need to work. And that's the way things were traditionally done. And then we kind of developed this idea about 100 years ago of this adolescent teen period where it was all about, finding yourself and goofing off and having fun with friends and maybe, getting drunk and these sorts of things. And then as the human life expectancy has increased through modern medicine and sanitation, we seem to stretch out that running around period, as the Amish would call it. They call it the Rumspringa, where you kind of run around and have fun and kind of do goofy things and get sowing your wild oats, so to say. So we've expanded that from being not just the teen years, but we expanded that into the 20s. That was very popular while I was growing up in the 80s and 90s with shows like Friends, where they were in their 20s. And then it just seems to keep progressing, as exactly like you said, where now we have shows like Big Bang Theory, where they're in their 30s. And so this has become the propaganda of our time, the pop culture image of our time, that you kind of just, basically screw around for 3 decades of your life. For your teens, your 20s, and your 30s are just this time to be going out and drinking and partying and having fun. And we keep putting off this idea of responsibility and of self-ownership. And we see that, even reflected in government institutions. And one of the critiques of Obamacare is that it expanded health insurance coverage for people, into their late 20s to still be on their parents' policy. And if we went back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and could sit down and talk to one of our ancestors and say, well, what would you think of your child still being dependent upon you in any way, shape, or form in their late 20s, their mid to late 20s, they would be appalled. They would say, well, I would have failed as a parent. Why would a child still be dependent upon me at all in their mid to late 20s?
Yeah, I was going to say, in those days, I mean, in the Catholic nations, if your daughter was like 20 and not married, you put her in the convent.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And there was that notion that the bloom would go off the rose, as they would say. I think that was a British term. But, yeah, that you needed to get married. If you look at, historically, you look at plays like Romeo and Juliet, quite famously, Juliet is coming up on her 13th birthday in that play, I believe. It was 13th or 14th. I can't remember if she was 13 and about to turn 14 or if she was 12 about to turn 13. But anyway, she was that age, and her mom famously tells Juliet in that play, you're an old maid. If you don't get married quite soon, you're going to be an old maid. At your age, I was already your mother. And of course, that's a bit extreme. That play takes place quite a number of hundreds of years ago. But the point being is that there was this idea that you needed to settle down and you needed to start your life and to have a traditional life when you were quite young, and that you needed to take that responsibility on yourself. And I was listening to a presentation when I lived in Northern California through some people in my church who had done ancestry, and they were telling stories of their ancestors that had lived in that area doing logging when they were logging the redwoods quite heavily up in that area. And families would have, would go and get logging permits, and mom and dad would help cut down the trees, mostly dad and older brothers, and they would put them on these logging trucks back when the early 1900s, when trucks were a relatively new thing. And they would put their 6-year-old at the bottom of the truck to work the pedals, and their 8-year-old at the top of the truck to drive the steering wheel. And the boys would drive that truck on a 2-day journey to the mill, sell the lumber at the mill, and then drive the 2-day journey back. And they had to do that because the father couldn't afford to lose those 4 days in cutting trees in order to take what they had cut in lumber to the lumber mill. And so the boys were responsible for it. And today we think, oh my goodness, I mean, putting these little children in a truck where they can't even reach the pedals, so one has to work the pedals and one has to work the wheel, and sending them on a 2-day journey where they're sleeping overnight in the truck, it sounds just unfathomable to us now, but our ancestors knew that you had to start instilling responsibility in children early. You needed to get them involved, and you needed to make them responsible. Otherwise, you were going to get adults who didn't know how to take care of themselves. And that's exactly what we have in our society today, because there's absolutely no notion within the family that parents are supposed to be training their children to have personal responsibility. And so we have these teenager, late teens and early 20s who kind of they're thrown out into the world, and they have no sense of what to do with themselves, and they just turn on the TV, and the TV tells them what to do, and they're following it.
Yeah, we don't even have any rituals anymore of adulthood, because teenager is a relatively new and to a large degree consumer, created term. Before you reached 14, you were you were apprenticed out, whether male or female, and you were also looking to get married. And a lot of cultures have very strong ritual. When you're Jewish, you get a bar mitzvah. The man, this may freak out a few people out there who are into the piercing culture, but you didn't come up with suspension. Okay, people? Suspension was the Mandan Indians. When you reached about 13 or 14, they stuck some eagle claws with string up, and you were suspended in the air from your skin. And you were there for a couple days, then you'd come down, and then you were now part of the tribe. You had rights to call yourself a man. Just as a side note, sometimes women would do this too, but still, it was a ritual that they had, and the Spartans, you'd have to go off in the mountains, and survive for a certain amount of time on your own. Just what I think it was just like a spear, and you weren't even clothed. You were just sent out naked with a spear and you had to survive. Our culture, what do we do? I mean, kids now, the only thing they have to look forward to is, oh, I'm turning 21. I'm going to get so drunk. That's our ritual. We don't, we don't have any rituals left that say, now you're a man, now you're a woman. We just kind of keep pushing it more and more. And I think small families do this too. You don't want to let go. That's your kid. That's your connection to being the parent, that you had that one kid and you don't want to let them go. You want to keep them young as long as you can. And of course that means they're not responsible when they get older.
Exactly. And they've had no time to practice that responsibility with younger siblings either. And that's something that I've noticed as a mom of a large family and having a lot of friends who have large families. And so they're still having babies when they have teenagers. My oldest is 12 and my youngest is a year and a half. And so if I have any more children, my oldest is going to be his teen years, when his younger siblings are born. And so that's a long period of time of having children, but also, so we have this instinct to start pushing the older kids towards more independence and more responsibility and more self-governorship. And so, I have a baby that's a baby and that needs me and that I can dote on and love and cuddle and snuggle and baby. And so I'm not trying to baby my 8-year-old, my 9-year-old, my 10-year-old. So I naturally will say, okay, if I'm have to spend time with the baby needs to nurse, or the baby needs to change, I need to change baby. So whatever you need at this moment, my 10-year-old or my 11-year-old, you need to figure out how to get that on your own. You need to be independent, and it's also an encouragement. My children feel so good when they look at an issue and they say, oh, I need help with this. I can't do this on my own. And I say, no, you can do this on your own. I'm here to support you, but I believe in you. You can do this on your own. They do it on their own. And then the sense of pride and confidence that they gain from being able to do that on their own is simply immeasurable. And I mentioned this in an interview I gave a few weeks ago. I had an interview scheduled, and then my husband was going to be home to take care of the children, and he ended up getting called into work. And my oldest son was also out at going to a class that he takes outside the house. And so I had my oldest child was 8. And so I had my 8-year-old, I had my 5-year-old, I had my 3-year-old, and my 1.5-year-old. And so I told my 8-year-old, I said, okay, buddy, it's your time to step up. And mom's going to go do her interview for about a half hour. And I'm going to give you, a movie and some snacks and a sippy cup for the baby. And you guys are going to hang out in this room. And I know you can handle it. And he did. He did great. When the baby needed to be changed, he changed her. He made sure she was drinking water while she ate her snack. He made sure that the 5-year-old and 3-year-old were being quiet. And it gave him a sense of pride and accomplishment. He came out, his eyes were sparkling. He said, Mom, I did it. And it was a wonderful experience for all of us. And yes, like you were saying, when you only have 1 or 2 children, your children don't get that experience and that opportunity of caring for younger siblings and having parents that through necessity have to push them towards independence. I through necessity have to push my 12-year-old to independence. So when he wants to take an art class outside of the house, I say, okay, great. That art class is only a mile away. So you need to ride your bike, because I can't pack up the whole family just to take you a mile every single day. So you need to take on this responsibility yourself. And when he first started doing that, it was a little dramatic at first. He said, oh, I have to bike a mile there and then a mile back and my legs hurt. And I told him, I said, suck it up. It'll just be a week and your legs won't hurt anymore and you'll be super strong. And now he does the ride just fine. And he's really proud of himself. And, after a few weeks, he said, oh, my legs don't hurt anymore. I said, see, you can do it. And we don't do that, because if he was my only child and he wanted to take an art class, I'd say, oh, well, okay. And I'll drive you and I'll do and let's go get a hot chocolate before. And not that those things aren't nice, to do, but that's not how you need to raise your children all the time. You can't baby them and coddle them and do everything for them all the time. You have to start pushing those little birdies out of the nest and letting them gain in some independence.
Absolutely. Hey, it sounds like you're raising kids kind of in that natural sense. And Especially along the lines that Alfred Adler, when he was talking about birth order and that the worst thing you can do to a child is to spoil them because they won't
Yes.
learn independence and so forth.
Yes.
The interesting thing is, I'd like to kind of get back to another point. Do you think that our culture, do you think a lot of the stuff on television and in education and so forth is actually intentionally designed around the premise of getting people to veer away from natural families because they're afraid the populations, when I went to college, there was all this population, we're all going to die. And when I was growing up, there was like Soylent Green and episodes of Star Trek where, they come to a planet where there's no room because everyone's, crowded and they're not dying. And then there's all these, even Logan's Run had a population premise. There was just so much of it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's actually, a concerted effort to get people, like in America to stop having children?
Oh, definitely. I think it's really hard to deny that there is. And when you look at it politically, and when you look at government involvement, and when you look at the popular media, as you were saying, and their portrayal of it since, the 1960s and 70s, definitely. I think this idea of overpopulation has seeped into almost every aspect of life, and it's held out almost as an idol to be worshipped. It's almost a new god for people. This idea of environmentalism and overpopulation being the main issue with the environment and resources and things like this. And I don't pretend to understand who exactly is trying to pull these strings. I don't know if it is an elite group of people that, really want to control all of these things, or if it was kind of just an idea that went viral and ended up seeping into popular media and government policies and social interaction between people and social stigma, the stigma now of having a large family that's common. I don't know if it just spread like that. Or if there's a specific group of people trying to actually push this for a greater agenda. But obviously it comes back to consumerism as well, because when you pull people away from their traditional culture and their values, as I was saying before, they have to fill that with a consumer culture, with being the person that, being the coffee shop girl, or being the person that wears designer clothes, or being the geek with all the tech. They have to take on one of these other identities if they're not having the identity of being a traditional mother, traditional father, or the identity of their heritage and their ancestors and their people. And so there's definitely a consumer aspect to this, because, they're going to be consuming more, obviously. And people think it's kind of funny because wouldn't a large family consume more? But you really don't. Those of us who have large families understand how little you consume actually from when you were a single person. And when you were a single person and you had all this extra money to just spend on yourself and to spend on clothes and fancy foods. And my husband and I were grocery shopping last night, and we kind of looked longingly at the avocados and said, oh, we just, we have 5 kids now. We don't have avocado money anymore. It's a rare treat for us to buy that kind of food, because we're feeding more people. And so, and you end up passing things down. You have lots of hand-me-downs. You're not buying new clothes all the time. It's a very simple life that most people work their way into when you have a large family. It's not a consumer-oriented life, and it's definitely not a media-driven life either for most large families, because there are so many playmates for the children. The children aren't asking to sit down in front of TV as much. They're not asking to go to the movies and play video games and do these sorts of media interaction-focused entertainment. They have a whole group of entertainment right there. So they're playing house, they're playing war, they're playing blocks or Legos, and they have so much other things to entertain themselves. They're not being sold into that consumer culture through the media either. So I think if you look at it, it definitely makes sense that big families are anti-consumer culture, and that independent individuals in their 30s and 40s with lots of expendable income are definitely what the consumer culture wants to create, because it sustains itself that way.
Yeah, it temporarily sustains itself. That's
yes,
yeah.
Right.
You can look at Germany, for instance. Germany has a really strong economy as Europe goes. I've heard actually that if you annex Germany into the United States, it would be behind Mississippi, actually, when it comes to true individual consumer economic power. It would actually be really low.
Right.
You can't go by the gross domestic product. I mean, you might as well say, oh yeah, everyone in Saudi Arabia is a billionaire. They're not. It's the royal family that's rich. But
right.
The thing is that that the consumer culture of Germany, that it won't sustain itself. Eventually it will collapse. I mean, you're either going to have to bring in lots of immigrants into the population to take the jobs because there's no young people being born. I mean, they have a birth rate of like 1 per woman, which you need over 2. You need over 2 because you have to not only replace people, but they have to make sure that you deal with mortality, infertility. I mean, actually 3 is replacement. True replacement's 3, because you may have
accidental death or, these sorts of things. Right?
No, 1 in 6 people is infertile. I mean, or they're going to experience infertility, and half of them will not be able to have kids. So, you'd have to make up for those people as well. Well, I mean, you're going to have to bring more people in, or they're going to have to develop robots. Like in Japan, they don't want to bring in immigrants, but they're trying to develop robots that will take care of the old people when they get old. But the thing is, it's not sustainable. It's like human society is a pyramid scheme, ultimately,
Right.
No matter what. I don't care what your economic system is. It could be communism, capitalism, fascism, whatever. You need young people that will take care of, while the middle-aged people are working and generating lots of money, you need the young people that'll take all the crummy jobs that you still need. And then they come up, and then they're the middle-aged, and then they're taking care of their elderly parents and that sort of thing. But we don't have that. So yeah, we'll be rich for a while, but then, just like Japan, their economy was good until they started getting so many people retiring. And that is when they started going down. They were no longer the ones that were going to take over the world economically. They are now, they're mentioned, they have a strong economy, but they're not the powerhouse that they used to be. And that's because of births, lack of births.
Yes, definitely. And I think that you hit on a good point talking about immigration, because when you bring in, whether it's the United States or whether it's Europe, when you try to bring in immigrants to replace the fact that you're not having babies, it doesn't quite work out very well, because you're bringing in people from very different cultures. They're not in high numbers, so they're not assimilating. And then you're also, if you're just kind of opening the floodgates to any immigrant that wants to come in at all, you're also not selecting for people that can actually do the jobs that you need. So basically, you're just having a lot of immigrants come in, and they're taking over jobs that teenagers could and should be doing, but they're not really taking over those jobs that the middle-aged people are doing. They're not the engineers. They're not the company vice presidents. They're not the lawyers. They're not the doctors. Mostly, vast numbers of them. And so it's still, when it gets down to it, you have to have babies. Any population that wants to sustain itself, has to have a good birth rate, at least, like you were saying, at least, 2.5, 3, on average per woman. You have to have that, because the immigration isn't going to save you.
Yeah. And the thing is, I mean, we have to say it. I know that neocons and also economic liberals tend to look at just people as work units, and not as individual cultures. I mean, I'm going to pass on whatever values I have to my children, who will then pass them on to their kids. And that's just a reality, and it's kind of a cool thing. You say that the ancestor way back there, you learn about your ancestors, what they went through. I mean, they didn't have it so good. I mean, they worked, many of them worked in, They worked until they retired, and then they went to bed, and then they got up and they worked again. They worked in mines, they worked in factories, they worked on the farm, they did all of these jobs, and before they had welfare, if they didn't work, they died. I mean, it was just that simple.
Yeah.
And people kind of sit back and they look at these TV shows like, I don't know, Downton Abbey and stuff like that, and they think, oh, I just wish I lived in that era. Well, yeah, sure, it's a show about some rich people who have some pretty pampered servants. and
right.
It's not the reality.
No, the reality is far, far different. And that's another thing too, when we don't understand our history and we don't understand our ancestors, we don't understand what's needed for today, because there are those fundamental principles of life that don't change, and one of them is hard work. That you are going to have to work, and we've tried to alleviate that through welfare systems and things like this, but we can only augment it so much, because that natural balance and that natural principle of life is going to get us in the end, that in order to survive, you must work, and you must work hard and every day, whether you're a man or a woman, or even a younger child. Children need to be helping and working within their household. And my family, we love to read literature that is historically, like, that was written in the historical time period that it's from. So unlike Downton Abbey, where it's this, very liberal minded, like, well, let's put them in pretty dresses with Edwardian backdrops, but let's basically play out liberal modern scenarios here with, people having affairs and people becoming lesbian and people, girls wearing pants and whatever thing they want to do there. That then people have this completely distorted and warped view of what our ancestors actually did and went through, both as far in terms of value and culture, and then also in terms of hard work. And so one of the things that I'm always advocating for people to do and to read is historical literature that was written in that time period. So reading something like A Little House on the Prairie, I think, is extremely valuable, because she's writing about what their life was really like. And when you read about how hard they worked, and no welfare system in place, and nothing to fall back on. So if your wheat harvest was eaten by grasshoppers, well, better luck next year. Hope you don't starve this winter. It was a harsh reality, and it also creates a gratefulness, I think, in us today, that we can say, oh wow, I do have a grocery store and things like this. So as long as I'm willing to put in some effort, no large calamity. Typically, I'm fairly safe from large calamities, as they had back then. And we get a sense of how hard we really do need to work, because that principle's not going away. We do have to work. And if we just build up this huge, bloated, fat, lazy welfare state, that will all collapse eventually anyways. And then people will starve then. We're just kind of putting off the starvation for the lazy if we just throw money at them.
Exactly. I interviewed a professor who's written books on what would happen if society collapses and stuff. And he said that if you had an EMP blast or a major solar eruption, which has happened in the past, happened in the 1870s, it knocked out telegraphs around the world. But if that happened now, it would knock out computers, electrical grids, and stuff like that. It'll happen eventually, but if it would happen, he said something that it was like 200 million Americans would die within a year. I mean, and he wasn't exaggerating. He just said that that's like 2/3 would die, because many of them don't even know how to. If you drop them in the woods, they're not going to survive.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody knows how to do anything anymore. They don't know how to grow food or store seeds or sew their own clothing or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately, we're kind of coming up on our time here, but ultimately, I think that if we try, I mean, a lot of people think it's actually mean nowadays. To require your kids to work and do all these kinds of things. But I don't think the kids that actually take responsibility are the ones you're going to see going to universities, having to have a safe room in case a professor says something that offends them, and they're so distraught over it they have to go sit and cuddle with a teddy bear. I do not think. I mean, we kind of know what families those kinds of people come from. They're very pampered and so forth. And then, the kid that's had to go and work and earn money, a paper route when it's snowing outside, stuff like that. Someone says something, a professor doesn't, says something, that offends them, then they're going to raise their hand and, argue with the professor, because they've got that kind of sense of strength that responsibility gives.
Yes, and the humility of wisdom. And I think that that's something really important, too, because when we allow our children to have some responsibility growing up and allow them even to make those mistakes, wisdom comes through making mistakes and having to deal with the natural consequences of those mistakes and learning to not make those mistakes again. And one thing that wisdom really instills in a human being as well is humility and saying, wow, I thought I knew how everything worked. I thought I had it all figured out, and I don't, because I've seen myself fail, and then I've seen myself come back from failure. But I've seen myself fail time and time again when I thought what I was doing was best. And so when they get into those situations where they have somebody in authority over them, whether that's a boss or a professor, they're not going to start pulling out that victim card saying, well, you're offending me and therefore you're wrong. And I know more than you. This incoming freshman in college knows more than the professor that's been working there for 20, 30 years. They're not going to have that sense of superiority, like they could never be wrong, if they've been allowed to gain the natural wisdom and humility that comes through hard work and responsibility.
No, absolutely. Hey, we're coming up on time here. I was wondering, maybe in the future here or near future, we could have a show on, you mentioned the thing about your studies in esoteric studies, feminism, stuff like that. That'd be a really interesting show too.
Oh yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
Oh yeah, excellent. That's I have a lot of fun with that. I had some people ask me today, because I said something about, well, Christmas is actually based on the festival of Saturnius, and they were like, "What's that?" And I explained it to them, and they were like, "What? That doesn't sound like Christmas." And I'm like, "Well, I went through the history. It's really fascinating." But you have some contacts, like a YouTube station or other areas where people can go and see more of what you've been up to?
Definitely. I am a big Twitteraholic, so I'm on Twitter all day. And so my handle at Twitter is @apurposefulwife. And then if they go to my Twitter, there are links in my bio to my blog. I also have a link to my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is YouTube/user/adorable Ayla, and Ayla spelled Ayla. So that's where they can find me over on YouTube.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing tonight with our audience. And again, I encourage people to go to your website and get more information.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed being here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Take care now.